Should I proceed? A second theme that I held up for your attention last week was a very interesting discussion in the founding period of the question of the desirable form of government. The desirable form of government. This is one of the foundational issues of political theory general. The great works of political theory very often have been focused on the question of what is the preferred or desirable form for civil government to take. And one of the most interesting things about the Reformed tradition is that there developed from the start a suspicion of concentrated power. Let me say that again, a suspicion of concentrated power. And that was particularly important at the time because in this period, the time of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, there was an emerging consensus among many people that the thing that was needed was strong monarchy, absolute monarchy, concentrating power in the hands of a strong leader who would be able to rule without any constraints, if any constraints at all. That was, interestingly enough, a kind of modern idea in France and in England and to some extent in Scotland. There was a strong resistance to that idea on the part of Reformed thinkers. They preferred one of two things, either a constitutional monarchy. And by the way, it's so interesting how in our own time, these issues of constitutionalism suddenly have a new relevance to our own thinking. I'll just say as an aside, one of the most interesting and important things that's happening in our own public life is a debate, a discussion about the meaning of democracy. And the proponents of what I would characterize as the standard way of thinking about democracy today affirms the need for constitutional limits. Well, that's rooted in something that was very much a part of our tradition. And then some people in the Reformed tradition went further and said, not only should we get rid of absolute monarchy, but we should get rid of monarchy altogether. And they moved in a Republican direction. I'll say more about that as this talk goes along. And then finally, not to belabor a very important topic, but there was also predictably a discussion of church and state. What is the proper relationship between civil authority and ecclesiastical authority? And in that period, in the founding period, even though there was an acceptance in many quarters, including Calvin, for example, of the need to have a close working relationship, a kind of collaboration of church and state, over time, even in the founding period, there was movement in the direction of something different. So 3 issues that I talked about last time: the ethics of resistance, the desirable form of government, and then finally the church-state relationship. Now, in the new phase that I'm going to be talking about today, which I've already indicated as a period running from the early 1700s through the late 1800s, I want to just emphasize 2 or 3 things about the circumstances that separated this period from what went before. The most important thing to note is the following. This is a period in which, after a long, long struggle over religion, there was a cooling of religious passion. In the 1700s and the 1800s, the passions which had driven people to war again and again and again, the great religious wars of the Reformation period, those passions began to cool. They didn't go away entirely. And there was still deep suspicion, sort of anti-ecumenical suspicion of one Christian confession over against another. In the early history, for example, of what became the United States of America, there was enormous strong among Protestants anti-Catholic feeling and still a tendency to demonize Catholics. But in general, what happens in this period is a waning of those passions and the end of it's a period in which we come to an end of the religious wars. The second thing that happens in this period, which to some extent is sort of the transition into the modern world, is a partitioning of religion along national lines, so that you get different countries and different parts of Europe in particular and then the wider world eventually identified as Catholic or Protestant in the Lutheran way or Protestant in the Reformed way. And by the way, all of you people are travelers, I'm sure. If you go to Europe, even to this day, you feel the influence of that partition. You go to Spain, it's one sort of world, and it's a world which was influenced by Catholicism in a way that now it's so different when you go to the Netherlands or to Denmark. These are places that have been shaped deeply by a kind of partitioning of Christianity into different versions: the Protestant Lutheran version, the Protestant Anglican version, the Protestant Reformed version, and then, of course, different versions of Catholicism. Well, in this period, that begins to crystallize. And England, the sort of the English-speaking world assumes a certain kind of identity, which is different from the French-speaking world, and so forth. And it's related very much to religion. Now, in that environment, the political agenda changes. The things which are on people's minds when they think about politics, when they struggle with trying to relate their faith to politics, change. And I want to suggest, in the course of the 3 talks I'm going to be giving here, 3 big issues that arise in that time, which are so different from the time I discussed last year. One is, once again, the topic of a revolution. Once again, the topic of revolution. And in particular, the topic of revolution arises because of 2 enormously, extraordinarily important events in not only just European history, but to some extent world history. And that is the American struggle for independence, which oftentimes was characterized as a revolution, and the French Revolution. Now, so I'll be talking about that today. How do we respond as Christians? How do we respond as Reformed Protestants to the phenomenon of revolution in this new, and I would say somewhat secular form? A second issue which arises in this period, and again, I think it has fascinating salience in our own time for obvious reasons, is how to respond to the pressures for democratization. Democratization. And I'll be talking about this in a way that I think you'll find informative next week, about the origins of democracy in the modern sense. There's a whole long history, of course, of the idea of democracy, which goes all the way back to antiquity. But democracy in the modern sense has a very distinctive set of connotations, and the pressures for democratization emerge in this period that I'm going to be discussing in this series of talks, and not before. And the moment that happens, that sort of pressure for democratization begins to surface, and people begin struggling with it. And I'm using the term initially, my initial sort of definitional statement will be, by democracy, I mean simply one man, one vote. And it was at that time man, not person. One man, one vote. The pressures for democratization in that sense present a whole new political agenda for people to struggle with. And then finally, a third topic I'm going to be taking up 2 weeks hence, not next week, but 2 weeks hence, is the topic of nationalism. This is a period in which I would argue nationalism really, in the modern sense, finally comes into the forefront of public life, and people have to struggle with it as people of faith, as well as in other dimensions of their lives. So, today, revolution, next week, democracy, and then in the third presentation, nationalism. In talking about the subject of revolution, I want to just remind you of a couple of things I said last week about the Reformed tradition and revolution. One of the great innovations of Reformed thought in the foundational period was an acceptance of the religious legitimacy of resistance, rebellion, and even revolution. Let me say that again. One of the great innovations of the Reformed political tradition. And by the way, this was developed in a whole series of very important theoretical writings that had influence long after their authors were dead and gone. An acceptance religiously of the legitimacy of resistance, rebellion, and even revolution. And because Reformed Christians did this in one place after another, embraced these ideas and acted on them and organized in order to be effective in their action, they got a reputation for being seditious. Oftentimes, and it's, I think, important to recognize that it was in this period, sort of after Calvin's death, that the term Calvinist began to become a popular one. Interestingly enough, used initially by people who were enemies of the Reform movement. Catholics in particular picked up this term and slung it around all the time. The Calvinist, and the Calvinist in their minds oftentimes was sort of by nature a seditious person, a rebellious person who was not content to simply accept inherited forms. And out of the sort of literature and action of Reform thinking about this period that we're talking about, there was a kind of sort of strong presumption that the following was true. If rulers repeatedly act unjustly, it is the responsibility of religious people to resist. If civil rulers repeatedly act unjustly, it is the responsibility of religious people to resist, not to accept this, not to say, as some counsel, this is God's will. No, no, no. To push back against unjust actions on the part of the ruler, and if the ruler persists in this, to overturn that ruler. Now, this is a group of people. I'm speaking here today. I know to a group of people who heard me and others talk a lot about the relevant history here, but let me just remind you, this resulted in civil war or insurrection in one country after another. Certainly in Scotland, John Knox led a revolution against the established authorities. It happened in France with a very different outcome. There were religious wars in the 1570s and 80s and 90s, a whole series of religious wars. By one count, 8 different civil wars, one after another, different episodes in which terrible struggle, violent struggle go on between organized Catholic political forces and organized Reform political forces. Ultimately, that led, of course, to a successful effort not only to marginalize the Protestants in France, but who were Reformed in the main, but to drive them out of the country. So that you have this huge movement of people called Huguenots into the Netherlands and into England, and of course, very much to these shores as well. And the Netherlands, of course, is another case in which Reform forces rise up, and not only do they resist successfully the imposition by a Spanish king of the Inquisition on Spain, but that leads to the creation of the Dutch nation. The Dutch nation literally is created out of a civil war fomented by our spiritual ancestors. And then, of course, there's the English Civil War, which was a very important 1640s event in preparing the way not only for the sort of a form of modern English government, but to some extent the American experience as well. So there was pushback against Roman Catholic monarchs that were thought to be acting unjustly, and pushback against Anglican monarchs who were thought to be acting unjustly as well. So out of that emerges, in the founding period, a tradition of sympathy for rebellion, a tradition of sympathy for rebellion. So that the first Reformed response when encountering revolution or anything like revolution in another circumstance is to say, well, maybe they got a point. Maybe they're justified in taking that action. And that in turn very much affected their response to the American Revolution. But then also it led to a similar response initially, but then something else happened in the French Revolution. And what I want to talk about in the time remaining to me today is the two very different experiences that Reformed Protestants had in dealing with the phenomenon of revolution in the American case and the French case. And when you put the two together, you get a good sense for what became sort of the settled Reformed response to the phenomenon of revolution in later periods, including our own. Now, the American case is fascinating. The American case really is fascinating because it will not surprise you that initially the Reformed response to the emerging possibility of independence achieved via a war that gradually begins to be crystallizing in the minds of people who thought of themselves as patriots in the 1760s, and of course, even more the 1770s. I'm sure all of you know, you've done enough reading to know that there was a lot of reluctance to embrace the idea of an actual war against the English. But as that idea began to emerge, the Reformed Protestant response on the whole was exceedingly positive. So there was a predisposition on their part to, in the light of the history I've told, to think sympathetically toward the possibility of a resistance, armed resistance if necessary. And then I would say that predisposition was powerfully reinforced by the actual experience of what became known as the American Revolution. Now, why was that? Why was it that in the American case, not only was there a predisposition to affirm the legitimacy, the desirability of resistance, but that was actually reinforced by the experience of encountering what went on in that revolution? Well, the first thing I want to say about that is the kind of revolution it was, the kind of revolution it was. Terribly important to emphasize this. It was, some people would say it wasn't even a revolution in the full sense. Of course, what they have in mind there is the French Revolution, or even more the Russian Revolution. And by that standard, you could argue the American Revolution, it's not really a revolution. It's something short of that. It's a struggle for independence and self-government, while at the same time assuming the desirability of a current existing way of life. Let me say that again. It was a push for independence, self-government, while at the same time taking for granted the legitimacy of the continuation of a current way of life with which people were familiar. So it was not, therefore, an effort that was, there were exceptions to this. There were radicals in the American struggle for independence, but on the whole, the thinking of particularly the founding fathers themselves was something much short of a complete transformation of the way of life they had inherited. And this struggle for independence could easily be justified by some of the same arguments that had been used by Reformed Protestants in earlier cases of rebellion of the kind I've mentioned, whether it be in England or Scotland or France or the Netherlands. Again and again, the argument was if, as I said before, if civil authority acts in a way that's contrary to what you believe to be the will of God and that it persists in that activity, then it's entirely appropriate to resist and, if necessary, take up arms and unseat that authority. So the arguments that had already been developed, especially regarding resistance to tyranny and the duty to resist that accompanied that, were arguments that had already been developed, could easily be appropriated and used in the American case, and they were, And this brings me to the next important point. In the case of the American struggle for independence, Reformed Protestants played a key role. Let me say that again. In the struggle for independence, Reformed Protestants played a key role. Indeed, you could argue they played a role that was central to the whole struggle and the effectiveness of the struggle. Many of you may know that the leadership for the struggle for independence came heavily from, in religious terms, two groups: Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Congregationalists and Presbyterians. There were Anglicans there, to be sure, but the Anglicans were profoundly divided on the issue of independence for Britain. Indeed, part of the attraction of the idea of independence from the Congregationalist and Presbyterian point of view was that it would prevent the English from imposing the Anglican form of Protestantism as a state religion in Britain, and there was worry about that in the United States, excuse me, and there was great worry about that. Well, that put the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. The Presbyterians concentrated in the middle colonies. The Congregationalists concentrated in New England. That put them rather strongly on the side for religious reasons of a struggle for independence. And the Presbyterian sort of level of activism in this struggle for independence was so great and so intense that some English people, actually, government authorities, actually characterized the struggle for independence as a Presbyterian revolt. You may not know, but one of the places that they identified as the center of resistance, the center of opposition to British rule was the College of New Jersey. Of course, that's an earlier name for Princeton. And above all, they identified as a very problematic figure, so much so that his family had to go into hiding. He, for a while, left Princeton, and that's the president of the College of New Jersey, John Witherspoon. And it's no accident, therefore. I think it's not an accident at all that Witherspoon, who'd been very outspoken, a Scot who came to this country, recruited to become the president of the College of New Jersey, almost from the get-go was an active proponent of American independence, and then began to use the phrase, the sacred cause of liberty, the sacred cause of liberty. And that was picked up in the literature of the propaganda, if you will, of the American struggle for independence. And going back to my thought a second ago, it's no accident, therefore, that in the signers, among the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the only one who's a clergyman is John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon, and that is kind of symbolically important because it shows the extent to which Presbyterians, in particular, although many Congregationalists in New England had similar views, were as a religious community, if you will, foursquare on the side of independence, foursquare on the side of resisting what they characterized as English oppression by whatever means necessary. So they actively, enthusiastically embraced the cause of resistance, and ultimately they characterized, toward the end of his life, Witherspoon lived to 1794. So he lived long enough to see, if you will, the further developments leading to eventually the movement beyond the Articles of Confederation, to the Constitution, to the creation of the new republic in a stable form. He characterized it in a famous sermon. He characterized the American struggle for independence as providential, as something which had come about through divine agency. Now, that's a striking manifestation, I think, of the way in which this, shall we say, legacy of commitment to the legitimacy of resistance then transferred into a new setting in the emerging new United States of America. One other thing I want to say about this, however, is very important, and that is the previous, shall we say, reformed rebellions had generally been in service of a particular idea. And the idea was this: we are dedicated to creating a holy commonwealth. That's what they wanted in France. That's what they wanted in Scotland. That's what they wanted in England. That's what they wanted in the Netherlands. And to the extent that they got power, that's what they tried to impose. That is, an established Reformed church, not separation of church and state, but an established Reformed church. Think of something very similar to Massachusetts Bay Colony on a national scale. That's what they were aiming for. This revolution was quite different. This revolution was quite different for the obvious reason that it took place in a situation that was manifestly pluralistic in religious terms. Let me say that again. The thing that was so different about the American struggle for independence, in contrast to earlier reform struggles for resistance to tyrannical authority, was that it took for granted religious pluralism. And nobody took for granted religious pluralism more completely than the Presbyterians in the middle colonies, where they did not control power. They didn't control power in New Jersey. They didn't, that is civil power in Delaware. They didn't control power in New York. They were one of several different, we would say, denominations. And they took for granted that. And then, of course, in the shaping of the foundations of the new republic, took for granted the need for what? A separation of civil and religious authority. And in turn, again, using Witherspoon's phrase, the sacred cause of liberty included religious liberty. The sacred cause of liberty was not just national self-determination, but it was religious liberty. Now, this is a turning point. This is a huge turning point. My experience in talking about this is that Presbyterians and more broadly Reformed Christians today take for granted the value of some separation of civil and religious authority and power, and the value of civil liberty, religious liberty. That is something which begins to emerge in this era, in this moment that I'm talking about here, and not before. Now, I've got maybe 10 minutes more, no more, to talk about the French Revolution. And I can talk about it very simply in the following way. The American Revolution had a kind of contagion to it in Europe, and to some extent, therefore, it's not inappropriate to think of the French Revolution, which occurs, you might say, on the heels of the American struggle for independence, as a kind of a follow-up to the American Rebellion. And certainly some of the leaders of the French Revolution would speak in that way. When it breaks out in 1789, there's a lot of echoing of some of the same language that was used in the American struggle for independence. But very quickly, I mean within months, it became evident that this was a different kind of phenomenon in multiple ways. And let me just mention some of the more obvious ones. This was not just a struggle for national self-determination. Indeed, that wasn't the issue at all. It was a struggle for a social transformation. In the first instance, it was a struggle for democracy, something I'm going to be talking about more next week. That is, letting the average man get involved in public life, have the average man have some say in public affairs. But never was it, even from the beginning, limited to just that. There's a famous phrase that comes out of the French Revolution, which captures very nicely the completeness of the aspiration: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty, equality, not just liberty, but liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that was interpreted in such a way as to include a rather thoroughgoing transformation of the whole way of life that the French had inherited. Doing away with a whole set of established institutions, doing away entirely with the monarchy, doing away with the aristocracy, and crucially important, doing away with the privileged role that the Roman Catholic Church had in French life. The aim was therefore radically revolutionary. The aim was radically revolutionary. That's what sometimes scholars think of as a real revolution, because it's not just changing one or two things, it's trying to transform the whole way of life. I once heard a famous lecturer on a lecture by a famous student of revolutions who said, "You'll know a revolution has happened if a decade later, your entire way of life has been turned upside down. Your entire way of life has been turned upside down." Well, that was not the American goal. I hope you understand. In the sense, the American goal was to preserve something which already was in place, simply in a different way. The French Revolution was clearly devoted to a much more fundamental transformation. And of course, it was exceedingly violent and involved something that very quickly gave revolution a bad name, and that is the exercise in a systematic way of terror. The idea of terror in the technical sense really emerges in the French Revolution. And then perhaps the most important thing of all for me to stress here is the French Revolution was anti-clerical, and not just anti-clerical, but in a sense, anti-Christian. It was driven by forces who one might say with some sympathy had a point when they said that the Roman Catholic Church is a kind of parasitic force in French life. They wanted to do away with this. They wanted to do away, but not just with the privileged status of the Roman Catholic Church. They wanted to replace the role that Catholicism had played in French life with a new kind of religion called the religion of reason. This is, you might say, the first important political manifestation of something that we've come to know as secular humanism. That is the reconstitution of public life in a thoroughly secular way. Now, It will not surprise you to hear that, and the other thing I want to stress is the attack on the role of Catholicism in French life was not limited to Catholics. It had oftentimes a ripple effect that adversely affected the lives, the fortunes of Protestants as well. So Protestants, because they were identified as part of this religious thing, this Christian thing, oftentimes suffered some of the adverse consequences of the attack on religion in the French Revolution as well. Now, it will not surprise you to hear that that revolution met with a different response from Reformed Protestants than the American struggle for independence, especially as it unfolded and it became more and more evident that the things I've been describing were in fact the case. So more and more Reformed Christians, particularly in this country, I might say, who were very interested initially responding to the French Revolution, responded to it with some appreciation, some respect, some sympathy, certainly, but then began to change their minds as the situation that I've been describing began to unfold. Now, the interesting thing to me, and here I'm about to conclude, is the following. For many people who ended up becoming, I would say, unambiguously conservative in their politics, the French Revolution was something that demonstrated in a very unambiguous way the folly of revolution entirely. One of the defining features of modern conservatism tends to be a sort of systematic rejection of the legitimacy of rebellion as a political form of political action. That was not the Reformed response, even though they had their minds sobered greatly about revolution by the experience in France. And the fascinating thing that emerges out of the sort of the complicated struggle with the consequences of the French Revolution in Reformed political thought is this: not a complete rejection of revolution, not a complete rejection of rebellion as a political possibility, but a much more complicated view of the, shall we say, the ethics of resistance, and a development of a way of thinking about the ethics of resistance that involved distinction between good and bad forms of rebellion, good and bad forms of revolutionary politics. Now, if I were moving quickly into the contemporary period, which I'm not going to do, I would say simply the following. That, in turn, has affected, that sort of complicated view has affected the way in which Reformed Christians have responded to events, particularly in the 20th century, in Latin America, in South Africa, various places, where they had the option of just rejecting outright the legitimacy of rebellion and did not take that option. Had a more complex view in which they recognized that in certain circumstances and in certain forms, resistance is not only legitimate, but in fact called for. Now let me stop there, lest I go on too long, and look at the chat to see what we've got there. Well, Steve Fox has had a variant. I think. Am I getting? Let's. Well, John's comment on Northern Ireland is fascinating.
That's John Gaffney.
Yeah,
That's one of the 20th century manifestations of the consequences of what I've been talking about.
would you like to repeat what John had in the chat?
Sorry for the inattention to that. Northern Ireland's separation, the partition in 1921, I think, from the Irish Republic is another example of the result of religious differences. It is indeed, but it's also an example, I would say, not just that, but what follows that great struggle eventually develops in Northern Ireland it does show the way in which this attitude towards rebellion ripples out into cases like that one. I mean, that's just, it's not
Modern era, the so-called Troubles.
Yeah, the Troubles are related to put it overly simply, the Troubles are related to the tradition I've been talking about. If I were to give 2 more lectures, you would see how this connects with a whole series of other episodes that follow after the French Revolution. Now, Steve Fox says, I'm struck by the similarity of your description of the reform justification for American independence to that of advocates of secession in the years leading to the US Civil War, the war for Southern independence. Both saw the existing political order as threatening their institutions and a way of life. To that, I would say absolutely. That's exactly right. And it's no accident. And from my point of view, this is kind of the dark side of the Reform tradition. It's no accident that Reform Christians and Presbyterians in particular played a key role in making those arguments in the development of the Confederacy. Absolutely. There were arguments about tyranny, independence, even the same. By the way, one of John Witherspoon's relatives, who was the president of Hampton-Sydney College, I believe, became a very important, shall we say, proponent of the cause of secession, sacred cause of liberty arguments of the kind that he had articulated at the time of the struggle for independence. The French espoused, John says, I think it must be the same John Gaffney. The French the French espoused freedom from religion rather than religion as we do. Very interesting observation, absolutely right. But let me elaborate on it. The French are very, I would say, effective proponents of republicanism as an ideology. Republicanism as an ideology. That is a whole approach to thinking about public life, which goes well beyond simply the affirmation of the idea of the republic in the narrow sense. Their republicanism is a full-blown political philosophy, bordering on a moral philosophy. And it is unmistakably secular. That is, that public life should be sanitized of religious influence. That's, for example, why even the manifestation of religion in a public place. Think of the famous burqa debates. The wearing of religious symbols in a public place is problematized in a way that Americans have a hard time understanding. Republican ideology for them means as much as possible, not just the marginalization of religion, but the exclusion of religion from public life, and they consider it to be a point of honor. I just want to say parenthetically, one of my most memorable teaching experiences at Georgetown was a seminar in which we were talking about contemporary political thought in certain sort of problem cases, and one of them had to do with this issue of the banning of religious representations particularly by women and Muslims in the public square in France. I had in that class 2 French men. They were men. I'll never forget that. French men, foreign students coming to the United States for a year, and on the one side of the table, and on the other side, 2 Muslim women who were Americans. The tension in that room between those two groups when we were talking about this subject, you could have cut it with a knife. And I think the thing that made it so tense was that the 2 French guys, well, both sides were very doctrinaire, but the 2 French guys in particular just said matter-of-factly, if you are a believer in a republic, you cannot accept any sort of public manifestation of religion. And of course, the Americans were scratching their heads. What are you talking about? And anyway, that just stands out in my mind as a kind of dramatic confrontation. Mm-hmm. Finally, one of the strange aspects of this is the American colonists were much more close to Knox in theology, but much more close to Voltaire in process. Well, I think that's right. I think that's right. That's a good statement. That's Michael. Although I think they would probably have resisted the idea that by embracing religious tolerance, they were adopting a view of that they would identify with Voltaire. They would say that religious tolerance was a religiously mandated responsibility. That was one of the most interesting things that happened in that period. That the tolerance, there in the history of sort of the emergence of religious tolerance, there is a sort of two-step movement in which initially, coming out of the great wars of religion, there is a kind of pragmatic acceptance of the need for religious tolerance just to stop the killing, just to stop the bloodshed. And that's on the Catholic side, on the Protestant side, that's sort of the first step. But in time, and in the Reformed case rather quickly, there's a movement beyond that to the recognition that no, it's not just that we have to accept tolerance because we haven't got enough power. We have to accept tolerance because it is something that is mandated, required by our faith. And by the way, in order for that argument to prevail, you've got to, and Roger Williams is the classic illustration. It's Roger Williams in his famous, powerful attack on religious persecution of any kind, said, if you are going to be at all a follower of Jesus on these matters, you've got to privilege the New Testament, and you've got to privilege in particular, not just the New Testament in general, but you've got to privilege the teachings of Jesus. Think about this for a moment. I'm sure this, what I'm about to say, would open up a long discussion, which we haven't got time for. But just think about the way in which this plays out. For the longest time, Reformed political thought was heavily rooted in the Old Testament and in the practice of Israel's kings and judges and so forth, combined with some sort of support from Paul, especially from Paul's teaching in Romans about being subject to authority. That ignores, you might say, it sets aside the love ethic of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus with regard to violence and so forth. And one of the things that happens as the case for toleration is made by Williams and others is that the case for toleration is justified in terms of a renewed emphasis on the Gospels, and in particular on the teachings of Jesus, as in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere. And Williams goes so far as to say, if you can't sort of commit yourself to those teachings, then there's something just very problematic about your claim to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Now that's a very strong claim, but that's where his thinking led.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
Just a couple more questions, and I think our time will.
By the way, all of those are great observations and questions. Thank you for those.
I guess one of the things that we might be heading toward next week as we look at democracy, though, is that a number of the leaders in the American Revolution were not Protestants per se. I mean, I don't know if you would say Unitarian, but did espouse a difference. So are we leading into that as far as the separation of church and state was concerned?
Well, I would say you're absolutely right that there is a pluralism of views among the founders. That's right. Among the founders, among the people who are the ones we most are aware of, who know about, the ones who drafted the documents, who provided political leadership. I would say the broad support for the cause of independence, the people who made it possible in terms of just boots on the ground, were heavily Protestant and Reformed, and they were not unaware of that.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. But the second thing I want to say, Carol, is this. I think the embrace of these principles and they're really two separate principles, no establishment and freedom of religion. And I hope you, by the way, if you haven't had a class or two on the tension between those two things, you need to have. In the history, it's a very important political education. See, we say separation of church and state, freedom of religion, as though those two things were neatly part of the same. They're not. They're two separate things, and they can even be argued to be in tension with one another. So the separation clause and the religious liberty affirmation are two separate things which were drawn together in the American founding. Now, the point I want to make is this. I think, above all, that was a result of the fact of religious pluralism in the colonies, especially among the colonies.
Yes.
Keep in mind, they, you had Anglicans here, and I'm in Virginia, for example. That was thought to be in sort of Anglican establishment. New England was something else again. The middle colonies were something else again. There was a pluralism among the colonies and then within the colonies as well. Some were more pluralistic as well. So unless they were going to do something which was extraordinarily disruptive, they were going to have to embrace a different idea of religion in public life than the one that was the favored one in Europe. So I think it was in the American case, it was initially a pragmatic necessity, which then turned into something which was valued on principle.
I think our time has escaped, but we're hanging on to this continuing development and the Protestant contribution to let's look at democracy as we look at it next week, and we can't thank you enough for continuing our journey. And I would encourage all of us to think about questions that you might have as we look at where we are today and the conflicting, we're still incredibly pluralistic today in many ways, thank goodness, in other ways not so much. But we really thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I hope all of you have a good week. And we'll see you in a week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.